tasting, rating, and sensory data. The last hour went by so quickly, we needed more time. So this is the first two-parter we've done. I'm looking forward to diving into a little bit deeper conversation. But it's only been a week since we last spoke. So how's everybody's week been?
Good.
So descriptive. You almost still be waking up. Any exciting developments? Anything going, extra exciting in your world that you want to share?
On the spot, yeah. I drank some really good beer last weekend. That's an easy one to start breaking this ice. I had a barley wine. Thanks, Laura. It was aged on pineapple and cherry. It reminded me of my favorite pineapple upside down cake. And at the end, everything was better.
Was it a beer you had before?
Nope. It was from Carton. We don't see a lot of them down here in North Carolina. And every time I get the fortune of drinking one, I wish there was more. I think, in my opinion, that's a mark of a brewery that I like, though.
Well, I think we actually missed the mark today. As much conversation as we had last week on barley wines, it should have been a requirement for today's conversation. And I do have a Bigfoot in my fridge 3 feet next to me. So don't tease me and don't encourage me to grab it. I don't know if that'd be a good idea or not.
It would be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, it would be an interesting conversation, Laura. But let's begin the conversation. I want to kind of dive back into each of your careers in the industry, because all of you are very interested, you're educators on how we can better the tasting experience. What made each of you, one, want to even do that? John, you're right next to me. When you first launched Esther, why did you even choose to go that route in your life?
That's a great question. I think it was kind of a couple of things coming together, starting with just a big part of my personality, right? So my mom, when I was a kid, was always telling me that I was very, very specific about what I liked and what I didn't like. And so if I said I didn't like my vegetables, then that was going to be the decision. And I was like, it's just something I don't like. It's very personal. So that sentiment was definitely there. And then later on, I really started diving deep into the flavor science, right? And doing my dissertation in college in the beer lab at the University of Leuven in Belgium, right, was definitely helping. And so dabbing into flavor and dabbing into the chemistry and the sensory elements there basically triggered something that I couldn't do a lot with, because this was 2006, I guess. So we didn't have technology yet, it seems. Like this was even pre-iPhone and stuff like that. So it's only 10 years later, when I was working at Colruyt Group, a big Belgian grocery retailer, where I was running their R&D and innovation, that I all of a sudden saw that there wasn't good flavor data, and that we didn't have great, detailed, actionable data on what people like, but mainly about why they like what they like. And so that became something that I was very passionate about. And then I needed to, move to a different continent to get like the kick that I needed to start my own company and become an entrepreneur. So it's all of these things coming together.
So why the focus in alcohol?
I think alcohol presents a tremendous opportunity, right? And so the reason why we focus on beer and wine right now is because the problem is the biggest there. We see categories of products as interesting when, first of all, flavor is an important element of the choices that consumers make, right? And for beer and wine, that is definitely the case. But you can give the same argument for chocolate and cheese and coffee and tea and things like that. But the second element is that there is a big variety in the assortment. And we look at the number of beers that are out there, the number of wines that are out there. It just makes for a really, really good technology problem. And that's why we started there.
That's fascinating. Thanks for sharing all that. Now, John, with Untappd, you've been a beer guy for quite some time, but what made you want to learn more and dive into the part of, just bettering the tasting experience, whether through sensory or whether through the ratings that Untappd uses? Why did you decide to get more involved in that industry?
Yeah, I mean, if I can be really honest, Andrew, Untappd at the time that I first started using it was just two guys in a garage, and I loved the app to get to kind of peel back the layer as Jean was talking about. Like in a grocery store, I can pick up any item on the shelf and I can pretty much see what it's going to taste like and what it's made of. And when I'm looking at beer, it's maybe a cool label and a bunch of things that I had no idea about. And I was experiencing German beer and beer with flavor. And it was amazing to me that this whole world existed that I didn't get to experience as a typical macro lager kid that grew up drinking that. So I dove right in. I'm a bit obsessive, maybe even neurotic, and I wanted to learn as much as I could about these things. And so Untappd at the time had just started working with a company in Wilmington, North Carolina, where I live. And I came to them and said, please, I want to work with you. I want to learn as much as I can. And they were kind enough to give me a chance. So in those 5 years, it was just an opportunity to really dive in. And what I think was most exciting was, you have like these rich, steep traditions of brewing lore and history that's older than our country. And then, you get into the last 5 years, 2 years, 1 year with seltzers and double dry hops. And it was just such an amazing time to see all these innovations taking place. Like Jean said, like when the iPhone came out and then the iPhone 2 and 7 and 30 and all those things just kept evolving so fast. It's been really exciting to like everything is always different and evolving. And that's what keeps it really exciting for me, just trying to keep up with when are we going to have double dry hop seltzers and what's the next thing past a quadruple IPA. So keeping up with it was the most fun.
I told myself I wouldn't mention seltzer today, but I got my hands on a barrel-aged seltzer, which I actually made a joke about last year, only to make jokes that actually do come true. So I don't know who was asking for it, but it's out there in the world. And I'm not going to crack that today either, John. Don't worry. Now, Laura, you wear lots of different hats in the beer world, but when did you decide to take more of a focus on the tasting experience?
I think that there were a couple of different parts. The education part in general kind of started, it was more event planning, but leaned into education when my brother had a crazy portfolio of imports and microbrews at that time. And the general public and the buyers in the liquor stores and the restaurants didn't understand what that was, why they would pay more for it. And he was sitting on a lot of inventory that was pretty amazing. And so that was the beginning of the Big Beers, Belgians, and Barleywines event. It's really an open trade show. That was the source of the that was the impetus for creating the event, which was, of course, to offer those buyers and the public a chance to taste and understand why they would then special order that from their liquor store or from their restaurant, and get those people to understand why that was important and necessary and special. I guess the second part of that is flash forward to not working with my brother in the distribution company anymore. I was tapped at the hotel that I was working in, more or less to like recover from all of my distribution world. And the general manager came and found me in the cafeteria one day, and he said, you know all about the beer industry and connections, and we don't have any hotel in the Vail Valley that specializes in craft beer. And it was GABF time. And he said, there's like 60,000, 45,000, 50,000 people in Denver that should be coming up here. And I want to create the reason for them to come. He said, so would you help us to build a program for the resort to help facilitate that happening? That was the best job I ever had. Once I convinced them that I didn't need to do accounting and the craft beer program, really being able to curate a list, work with all the suppliers, create little promotional events for both the staff and the guests, and really work with the staff day in and day out to taste and pair with other things on the menu, and work through the Cicerone certification with them. That's really when the educational stuff got turned up to full blast.
That's amazing. And did you envision even then as an early event planner that your festival would go for nearly 2 decades and counting?
No, and it's not the same festival it was then, but we can still count that. I think that the idea that we have morphed and changed, and the support from the brewers has been so consistently, overwhelmingly positive. It's the only reason I held on. I mean, there was no income from that for me for the first 14 years or so of doing that, and we didn't break even to donate the first several years either. So it was really just a product of them being so excited about it that motivated me to keep going. So it's been surprising all the way around. There was no reason for it to last forever. I mean, High Point doesn't exist anymore. And that was my brother's business in distribution. That was the original impetus for the thing.
And we talked a lot last session about just community and craft beer. While I have not been to Big Beers, just what I hear from other people in the community you've created there truly is a special place.
It's pretty awesome. I have to say that I enjoy getting to see everybody, but more than that, I enjoy seeing them have a good time, because for me, that's like a blur of about 8 days of, okay, where's the ball dropping and where do I need to pick it up and what piano fell out of the sky, because it's just so many moving parts.
Wait, you mean as the event planner, you don't actually get to enjoy the event?
Oh, good Lord. People come up to me and they say, and I met you at Big Beers, and I say, okay, that's awesome. Can we try again?
Yeah, there must have been beer involved. Well, Jacob, on to you. What made you want to get more into the educational tasting side of the craft beer industry?
Yeah, it was it kind of just fell into place for me because my background, I graduated from University of Delaware with a biology degree in 2016. So, I'm pretty young and new. I'm only 27, and White Labs was my first career in the brewing industry. So I had moved to San Diego in 2017 right after that, kind of searching for what do I want to do with my life in a way. And some people had recommended looking at White Labs. I didn't really know too much about beer yet, or was really involved in any kind of community revolving around beer. I liked trying new things and going to different breweries. But once I started really getting a grasp of, reading books and getting a grasp of what it was all about, it kind of meshed perfectly with everything I'm interested in. I grew up loving like history and culture and studying that, anthropology and things like that. I'm very, I break things off in sections in my mind really like easily, like, I don't know, kind of thinking about like Legos and like building and having things separated. So, learning everything about malt, learning everything about hops, learning everything about yeast, that was really attractive to me. Beer styles, they're not specific, but in the same way they kind of are. And that was awesome to me. So once I started at White Labs, just working in the taste room, I was trying to gain as much knowledge as I could as fast as possible. Went through, the Cicerone program and got my certified Cicerone, started judging for the BJCP. And that's really what led me down the education pathway, because the experience I had coming into the industry was so amazing. People were so willing to reach out and help and give me as much information, as much material as they could to continue progressing through my studying. And I want people to have that same experience I had. And so that's kind of what led me down this pathway, is if I can do that for anyone else, that's going to be really rewarding for me, because it's really changed my life and helped me in a lot of ways.
And that passion to share is definitely contagious. And when you talk to people behind the bar, sharing them what you know about White Labs, the beers, everything regarding just craft beer in general, if you're excited about it, it's going to convey. So that's awesome. You found the love for that.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, I want to look back on the past year. What a weird pandemic, past 16, 17 months it has been. Things are slowly starting to get normal. And John, with Untappd, I'm going to direct this to you to start, because last week you mentioned that you don't drink in a vacuum. You drink with friends. Drinking is a social activity. But the past year, it hasn't been very social. So how have your drinking habits, or what observations have you made on other people's drinking habits, changed over the pandemic?
Oh man. Okay, so I'll start with the easy part. How have my drinking habits changed?
Well, first, more or less barley wines? We'll start with the simple one.
More. Without the commute to and from work as often, it's been easier to have a barley wine for lunch, and that's something I really enjoy. So that I don't want to say that the pandemic has been good, but you can find little good moments in there. But I think really like how my drinking habits changed is I drank less, and it wasn't intentional, but there wasn't that, like we're going to go out for a pint after work or in between lunch or something like that. You didn't have that kind of social drive to go have a beer and talk about your day. It was me and my wife at home, and we also drink together, but the lack of that, like there's probably some sort of beautiful fable in here, but when I didn't have the social environment, I wasn't as naturally prompted to have a drink. However, I do have a wonderful 80,000-year-old neighbor named Jim, and he's a huge Pink Floyd fan. And I started introducing craft beer to him, and we would talk about, he's like, oh, I was in Germany, and so it was really exciting to at least scratch that itch for me to share cool, weird, fruited Berliners with Jim and hear what he was thinking about it. And on Untappd, I think one of the coolest things early in the pandemic was we saw a huge shift going from primarily Untappd users, give me the one of one, the beer that only exists for 10 minutes in the world. And early on in the pandemic, there was a big shift going back to like those nostalgic core brands. Hard to say whether it was a value driven because we were all afraid we were going to be broke in a week, or if there was like some nostalgic sort of meat and potatoes going back to Sierra Nevada Pale Ale and stuff. But I thought that was really cool to see those core brands get a good proper refresh from some of the real enthusiastic beer nerds.
And John, on the Untappd standpoint, did you see any changes in general, how people rate beer? Were there higher ratings, lower ratings? Do you have any data or interesting points on that?
There was more ratings. I think I could say that confidently. Sometimes an Untappd user will just check into a beer to kind of earn the reward or the badge. During the pandemic, especially like once we were all the majority were used to just being stuck at home, you saw people start to spend more time, and instead of just 4 out of 5, 1 out of 5, whatever, they would take a photo. Sometimes they would take a really exorbitant photo and put some work into it, but also the reviews would get longer. I don't know the specifics, but if our average review might have been 12 words, over last year, it jumped up to closer to 20. And I think if I can extract anything from there, it's that we were all bored, or we were trying to explain our beer drinking as we're home and invite some social commentary as well.
That's really interesting insight there. Now, everyone else today, what changes did you make to your drinking patterns during the pandemic, or any observations you made as a whole to the general public?
So I think for me personally, I drank more often, but less volume. So I think the lack of social context meant that when I was home, I got into a habit of having a beer almost, every day and trying 1, maybe 2 different beers. So I think I was much more into tasting beer instead of drinking beer, which was interesting to see for me personally. And what I read and what I hear and what we see as well is that that's at least a pattern that a number of people have adopted, right? So that there has been a shift to more diversity in tasting and like trying different brands, different types of beer, which is something that we hope will continue, because that's where obviously our technology becomes interesting.
And Jean, while I have you, during the pandemic, there's been all those buzzwords we've heard, like pivot, innovate. I could go on and on about all those little words we got tired of hearing. But one thing I did notice in a lot of businesses, not just in the craft beer industry, they had to reevaluate what they were doing. They had to look at their company and look towards the future, and not just focus on the beer side of their business, but on the business side of their business. And it sounds like common sense when you say it out loud, but a lot of focus was on the actual business model. With breweries reevaluating their business models, how did that affect ESTER? Did you see more companies get interested in the data that you provide, or did it have any impact on you as a company?
Definitely. I think, obviously April until I would say somewhere in the summer, not a lot happened, right? So all the things that we had lined up at that point had to be at least delayed, if not killed. So in that sense, it wasn't super easy, but it did allow us to go back to the drawing board and really see like what the added value was that we could bring and how we need to bring it. So I would say like that period was, I read an interesting article that's called that period the WTF period, right? It was like everybody was like, what is happening? Every retailer was trying to stock shelves. They were trying to make sure that people could shop safely, and there was no room for anything else. What we saw in late last year was that transitioned into, okay, how are we going to adapt to this new world? And a lot of companies started experimenting, and we definitely started to see an uptick in conversations that we've had, still very careful, but definitely on the retail side, for example, there were a lot of retailers thinking to do more e-commerce, to move towards different models, pickup models, online information sharing, in-store low-touch solutions, etc. And that kind of drove our roadmap of development as well in what we were building. With the producers, I felt at least that up until maybe 2 months ago, a lot of brewers were really taking a very conservative approach, and rightfully so, to be honest. I don't blame anyone. Everybody was trying to conserve energy, it seemed, and make sure that they were ready for things going back to normal a little bit. And that's what we're starting to see now, hopefully in a sustainable way. But the goal now is that, or the sentiment that we see now is that most breweries are really starting to go back to normal, starting to see tap rooms reopening, starting to see their usual business pick up, and still are looking to, become more resilient for what might come in the future. So that opens up a lot of possibility for us. But it definitely changed us as a company. That's true.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing all that. Now, Jacob and Laura, I'd love to hear about, how your drinking habits have changed over the past 16, 17 months or so.
I'll go first, I guess. I would say my drinking habits have changed in 3 different ways. Tasting, taking that time for sure. I spent more time going to the local bottle shop and getting styles or getting things from breweries that I don't typically do on a regular basis, and sitting down and really going through it, doing side-by-side comparisons or tasting similar styles next to each other. That was probably in the very beginning when it was really boring and trying to find something to do all day. Another thing that I think a lot of people did, as well as myself, is I started looking for healthier options, especially in beer. I found myself drinking more volume actually, but I had more time to do it since we were just sitting at home. And I think that mixed with sitting around, I really wanted to look for those low calorie options, and some of these low cal IPAs that are only 4.5% have become more attractive to people, non-alcoholic beers, and then also fermented beverages outside of beer as well. And then the third thing is I'm definitely drinking lower alcohol beverages. So like I started buying more bulk beer that's around 4.5%, because I found myself, at noon wanting to just sip on a beer for a little bit, and then maybe at 4, maybe later in the day. So it's kind of like spread out more throughout the day rather than just within an hour and a half. So yeah, all 3 of those things combined was really what I changed, or saw a change in my drinking habits, as well as I think the general public.
And taking the time to enjoy beers alone at your house, and side-by-side comparisons, like you mentioned, has it changed the way you will continue to educate guests who come to White Labs?
I don't know if it'll change it, but I think it'll help. It definitely, benefits me and helps me communicate different things. Any practice is good, and it's going to make you better in the long run. But also, I think it's, doing that every once in a while, it kind of brings you back to when we're talking about beer every single day. Sometimes you kind of lose that passion or love for it in a way. And I think having that time to really sit down and go back to to just enjoying beer for what it is. And the social aspect of beer is the best part, but taking that out a little bit and just appreciating the beer for the beer, it was really nice. And I think that kind of can help, bringing that into the education aspect as well.
Yeah, simple reminders are definitely valuable. Laura, how about you? How's your drinking been over the past year?
Well, I've always been a social drinker. So at home was just not something that happened much. At Big Beers, I get crazy amounts of gifts of homebrew and the things that people bring me. And it's embarrassing to say that a lot of it I don't make it through just simply because I usually go out to be social. I living here in Cleveland, though, with my dad, one day a week, I would go visit my friends and have what I called adult night. And that always involved an adult beverage. And so that's been kind of a routine that I didn't have pre-pandemic that has been a delightful respite here. But I wanted to also comment on John from Untappd's observation about the flagship kind of evolution there, particularly at the beginning. And I think for me, there was very definitely an element of there's so much unknown with the pandemic and what's going to happen and our jobs and the economy and all the election garbage that was going on at that time. There was so much variable and unknown that I think there was a great deal of comfort in choosing something that was not unknown. I think we went for really reinforcing the fact that there's something that we can choose that will have an expected outcome and that we know that we will enjoy. And I think that was a big element of a lot of things for me. I generally tend to read a lot of new things, and I found myself going back and reading things that I knew how it was going to come out in the end, just simply because I couldn't handle a lot more uncertainty.
That's really good insight there. And one thing I do want to talk about, we've mentioned flagships a lot. I want to kind of tie that into, the production side. We talk about flagships rising over the pandemic. I mean, people bought in larger formats. Jacob, you mentioned that as well. Low alcohol trends. Now, taking those points and combining them with, say, the Untappd ratings, the data, Jean, that you have with ESTER, how do all these factors come together to influence production? What trends do you expect to see moving forward with regards to John with Untappd, say the influence of your ratings on how a brewery produces? I mean, do you see breweries actively, taking a look at their ratings and basing production trends on that? And Jean, kind of looking at your model, is your goal to provide breweries that data that they then use the feedback you give, the flavor profiles, to base a lot of their upcoming releases on that?
I can start off there, and then I'll let John jump in as well. I mean, the last thing that I want is that the data becomes leading, right? So I think that the beauty of the craft industry, whether it's for beer, wine, cheese, whatever it is that a lot of the development of new products is being done based on gut feeling, based on craft, based on in French we have a beautiful word called métier. It's like craftsmanship, and I think that's still one of the key components of making beer. And I wouldn't want a brewer to say, I'm only going to brew beer that I know people will like, because that becomes very boring, and it doesn't add innovation to the craft brewing scene, which when I look at the American craft brewing scene as a European, I am amazed by the level of innovation that happens here. And I think in Europe and definitely in a country like Belgium, we sometimes forget that, and that innovation is something good. And I think we're so stuck in our tradition sometimes that we make less exciting beer. Not saying that it's not good beer, obviously. So that's one element. But that being said, I think data can help to de-risk decision making, and that's what we want to do. So we want to help these craftsmen and help these companies to make decisions that are innovative, and make a beer and having it in front of them and being like, oof, we're not sure that this is gonna work right out there. and let's run it through the ESTER data and see if there is data that indicates that it is going to work. So that's basically my dream scenario, is that moving forward, that's the service that we provide, instead of telling them like, oh, an IPA is going to sell well, so you should, brew that kind of IPA. Yeah, that's my basic view perspective on that.
From a data guy, that's a really interesting perspective, because I almost expected you to take the approach of, everything should be data driven, but I love how you think there's still that craftsmanship that needs to be involved.
Yeah, it's really, really important. And I mean, I think for a data guy, it's exactly that we should be doing with data, right? Data is to enhance decision making. Data is to support decision making. To inform decision making, to de-risk decision. The minute data becomes leading, and definitely when you start using artificial intelligence and machine learning, and you start basing decisions solely on the data, that's when you start making some really, really bad mistakes as well. So
interesting points there. Now, John with Untappd, what's your take?
One, I want to remember the métier, the French word for craftsmanship, and I want to name a brewery after that. It's beautiful. If it hasn't been done yet, we could all go in together. But in terms of, I think Jean answered it perfectly. In the data shouldn't make the decision for you. If I ask Google what's the best beer in the world right now, I'm afraid of what the answer would be. But using it is like a second set of eyes, right? I think we live in a time right now where no one's confident they have the right answer, regardless of what their job or experience is. So being able to say, what type of IPA should I brew that's selling the best right now or rating the best right now? Not necessarily this pickle beer did good, so you should make a pickle beer. I mean, sure, sometimes innovation takes us down a really weird path and it takes a while to come back. But in terms of Untappd data, we would get a lot of requests, right, from a brewery. I don't like this rating. That's a whole different argument, but it points a finger at kind of the good and the bad of that. It's a completely subjective, sometimes completely unqualified opinion of one of your drinkers, which really, to put it bluntly, shouldn't matter at all. 100, 1,000, 10,000 of those opinions stacked up is where I think you can find some direction. And again, if you want to let your Marzen sit in a cave for an extra week, Untappd isn't going to be able to tell you whether that's right or wrong. But you can use those opinions, your 4-week lager versus your 3-week lager, and weigh in what everyone says. And you can kind of come to a conclusion on, do the masses appreciate one better or not, and use that to guide next year's Oktoberfest. And that's the type of, I think when it comes to the way breweries use Untappd data, that's probably, in my opinion, that's the best and perhaps only way they should be thinking about it, until ESTER and Untappd work together and we can AI the whole beer process and Google can make beers for us and we can all just relax.
Well, it's not just affecting the brewery's decision makers. There's a lot of retailers that it impacts as well. There's certain, online retailers who may or may not only carry beers that have a certain level of Untappd rating. For companies like that, is that in turn telling the brewery, you need to make these specific styles that people are rating high so we can carry them?
I think I think I'm going to say it comes down to the opinion of the brewer, or really the financer behind the operation. Do you want to make something that's at scale, national, or do you want to kind of just control your neighborhood and be a spot where local people can come and have a beer? And how big do you want that to get? That should be the first part of that decision, not just, I need to make a 4-star beer so it gets into this distribution network. And there are, like, even on a smaller scale, I worked in grocery for a while, and when I was looking at what beers to bring in, Untappd was a huge part of that decision. I didn't want to bring in a beer that 30 of my local Untappd friends had already had and didn't like. yeah, I would use that data to say, all right, let me find a beer that they do enjoy and appreciate, because it's going to be easier for me to sell. And that helped, or I used that to make a lot of decisions, because I didn't want beer to sit on the shelf that people weren't going to enjoy, or even worse, that I wasn't going to be able to sell with confidence. Like Rogue's Sriracha Stout, great beer, beautiful label, but I would always make sure to say, like, this is kind of a niche, like, collector's item. You're going to want to make sure you enjoy spicy beer. It's an amazing experience, but there's a reason you wouldn't buy a 12-pack of it. And just being honest with people about that up front. And usually they would look at the Untappd data as well. And it was a guidepost for them, but it was never the decision maker. Usually we would talk about it first. And I think that's the way to use that type of data.
Laura, did you have something you wanted to add?
I do. I think it's interesting, the difference in the application of the data the farther you move closer to the customer. I think that the interesting part of running the resort beer program, for example, was that the decision about what went on the list had two extreme ends. One was, as a tourist in Colorado, there was always this goal that everybody who visited had to have a Fat Tire and had to have a Coors Light. So regardless of what you thought of either beer, you needed to have it, albeit in a bottle or a can under the bar somewhere, not on draft. And another interesting component was that if the staff liked a beer and it was paired well with a dish on the menu, we could sell a whole lot more of both. And so in the eternal quest of making sure there's something new and different on the list also, you didn't rotate that one because it was working really well. And so I think it's really interesting. Our staff didn't always pick what the brewers picked, and sometimes that beer was all of a sudden not available in our area anymore. And that was kind of based on the odd subjective decisions of the distributors in our area. But it was really, really noteworthy that sometimes something off the beaten path really went well with a particular dish, really sold really well, and was going to be on the list as long as the staff supported it. So interesting too, that our customers, our guests that would come dine, if they enjoyed it, they would head straight to the liquor store and look for that same beer. So it's interesting how that drives things.
I agree with you. It's all about setting. When you're in the grocery store by yourself, not sure what you want, you might be looking at that beer that has the highest Untappd rating, and that could be your pick. But when you're behind the bar interacting with staff and you're having whatever you're having for dinner, and they recommend something you wouldn't typically go for, you could definitely going to be more apt to make that decision that wouldn't be your usual pick, just because of the circumstances and that human interaction. So I think the experience component is absolutely huge. Jacob, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, kind of going backwards a little bit, talking about the when John from ESTER was talking about the craftsmanship, but like people going to the data, and then we're also speaking about the the beers that came about on Untappd that are the staples, right? The old school beers that everyone kind of went back to. From a production standpoint and from an ingredient supplier standpoint, I think we saw a lot of companies not trying new crazy strains, not producing those unique beers with a strain that they only buy for that one fermentation. They're sticking more to the tried and true strains for their core brands. And so that's kind of from my lens and from my perspective, something that we saw as well that kind of fits into that general theme overall.
I want to transition this conversation to talk a little bit about like beer competitions and, how we actually rate beers. Jean, first off with ESTER, can you talk a little bit about the data that your company provides on a beer? If I were to submit a beer to you, what's going to get kicked back to the brewery?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So basically, whenever a beer gets sent to us, we do an analysis on 3 elements. And so the first element is we look at all the data that we can capture about the product itself. So, description, brewery, ABV, like the things that are on the label. The label itself is something we look at, packaging, etc. So that's one level of data. A second level of data is that we do a full sensory analysis. And, when I talk about sensory analysis, in this case, I talk about a descriptive sensory analysis by a trained panel, where we don't look at appreciation necessarily. We look at really describing the flavor components of that beer. And then those are around 50 data points that we look at. We do some off-flavor analysis, etc. And then a third element is a chemical analysis, where we use our lab and the software that we developed together with the University of Leuven to get around 250 components out of a beer and really map the entire flavor profile. Now, those three elements together are just the data about your beer, right? And that's your fingerprint of your beer. What we find important and where we think we can make the difference is that we give you that data on a platform that also puts it in perspective compared to other beers, compared to, the competition, any other beer that exists in the markets, right? And we show you how close or far you are to any beer in our database and what the differentiating factors of your beer are. And so to us, that's like a perfect way for a brewer to, in a very affordable way, look at, how they're doing, what their flagship looks like, look at how it compares to other beers that people might know. And it teaches them a lot about not only what is in the beer, but also how to talk about it.
When a brewer submits a beer to you, do you base it on certain guidelines, like it's style specific? Like if I submitted, say, just a stout, are you going to compare it to other stouts, or how does it kind of get put in the system for any certain characteristics it should have? That way your data can pinpoint that it maybe shouldn't have this flavor or it does have this expected flavor.
Yeah. So when we do the comparison to other beers in a style, we're going to compare. You can drill down, like you can say, I want to compare to all the beers in the market, but then you can drill down on two levels. One is style and one is geography, right? And given the amount of beers we have, we don't do a drill down onto a city level. It's more like a state level or even a US level. But we hope that is going to increase as we move forward. And then if you ask me, like, what should a beer profile look like, that's not for me to say anything about that. So I am going to tell you how your beer compares to other stouts in the market, and then it's up to you to decide whether your profile and the differences between your beer and other beers in the market, whether that is something that you want or not want as a brewer. And so we don't make any call about like what is good and what is bad, because I think that the brewer should decide that, just like the consumer should decide if something is tasty or not tasty.
So you're not saying this is the best beer in our system. You're merely putting them side by side and letting the breweries just compare notes.
Yeah. And then we can tell you what consumers like best, right? So that's something that we can absolutely tell you, but we are absolutely trying to stay away from putting a value, like putting a star system, an appreciation score on a beer. That's not what we do.
One reason I wanted to bring this up is, looking at beer competitions and looking at programs like BJCP that, give you the guidelines you should follow sometimes when you're judging a beer. Do you all foresee ratings ever taking over that aspect of our industry, or will there always be a value for in-person human beer competitions where actual people are rating and giving their feedback at that exact moment of that beer?
I'll give a very short answer and then let everyone else talk. I think competitions have their place, and I see the value of that. I see it as it's like an influencer on Instagram, right? It's people who are knowledgeable and who we trust, and it's like listening to a sommelier in a restaurant. You're going to trust their judgment, and there's always going to be a place for that. My only thing is that I think that sometimes people will have a different flavor preference, and that flavor preference is super individual. So a beer that gets a high rating on a festival, to me, it doesn't mean that beer is necessarily better than others. It is perceived better by the people that judged it than others. And it's always a relative score. That would be my input.
I can weigh in on that one. I set up a lot of homebrew competitions. Big Beers doesn't do a competition on the commercial brewery side because we don't want to step on any egos. But in the homebrew competition world, the intent of judging is to provide feedback to the brewer and suggestions for systems and processes and actual brewing suggestions to eliminate that defect or to make this more fruity or blah, blah, blah. The other piece of that, which applies to both homebrew and commercial brewing, that I think is the most interesting piece, is that when you do BJCP judging, which I believe kind of applies to all of the like world judging stuff, you're judging something to a specific style. And listening to Peter Buchert, of all people, he says that is for the birds, because just because you know how to brew to style doesn't mean that you're a better brewer than someone who brews from the heart and throws the style book out the window. And it's very difficult to subjectively evaluate without trying to judge to style, because it is such a wild card moving target sort of thing. So I think it's really an interesting question about why are you judging? How are you judging? And what use does that serve? And I think that the feedback to the homebrewers is the most useful piece for judging if we have to compete.
And Laura, what are your thoughts on, why not just have a homebrew competition where they're sending Esther all of their beers and just getting the notes back from Esther?
Well, Esther doesn't brew. I mean, Esther is evaluating on a billion different flavor points, but they can't tell you how to add more of that component or subtract some of that component, or, hey, when I was brewing this, a couple weeks ago, I had a leak at this point in the processing of the brewing of the whatever, and I added a little bit of this thing, and it seemed to make it go away. So you might want to try that. I mean, I think there's so much that is experientially based, and especially since I'm in Colorado, I can talk to altitude and environment. All altitude and environment is not the same. And so solutions at sea level might not be solutions at altitude. So I think to have a more universal answer might not serve in the same way in this case. Jean, I may have misspoken. I don't know that Esther does have brewing knowledge that you're providing as feedback.
Well, we do up to a certain extent. So we work actively with the lab in Leuven, and they brew all the time. They're yeast producers, but they do test brewing, and all of those people are brewers. I'm a amateur brewer myself as well. But it's definitely true, Laura, like we observe in the first place. And so we look at those values for a number of the off flavors that we detect. We offer strategies to kind of mitigate that or to solve for that. But definitely, like there's a lot from experience to be learned. So I agree with your statement. I think it's not black and white, but I think there's definitely a value in getting feedback from your industry peers as well. That being said, Andrew, I think sending their beers to Esther for analysis is just a no-brainer. But that's it.
The Esther homebrew competition coming to you later this year.
Exactly. Yeah.
You get blame or credit for that, Andrew. I think the idea of knowing if there's off flavors and issues for sure that Esther would be able to point to and say, you might want to look at fixing these things. Where that problem is in your own system might be a different question, but absolutely not diminishing the value of that in any way. I think the person human part of the homebrew judging it by the homebrewer is a different way to approach that.
Yeah, I think it all goes into the big picture. The more angles you can take to this, the better beer we can create. Jacob, you're up.
Yeah, I was going to kind of say, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a lot of compounds that are parts per trillion that I'm not sure if we have the technology to test at this point, or not as frequently as we would need to be able to do it on a mass scale. And so I think that part, that's where like the human component can really play a big role, is those kind of nuances that you can't really put to the data. Here we're doing a lot. We have analytical laboratory on site where we run every beer we brew through it, and we can look at that data and see the full ester profile, off flavors, acetaldehyde, diacetyl, all that. But taking that and tasting it, seeing what the panel says, and going back to it, we can get a lot from the data and the panel to see that it matches up in a lot of ways. But there's also those kind of unexplainables. And I know we're probably not doing as in-depth of analysis as ester is every single time. But beer changes too, really, really frequently, depending on aspects that aren't just related to flavor, but as the age of it, the matter in which it's served, all these things play a role. And I think that's where the human component is still going to be valuable. But I do agree that judging to a style versus overall enjoyment is a very gray area, and that you do need to judge to something. But I think that's where like ester, and then comparing all the stuff that you guys compare, is really where that overall enjoyment level may be more specific than just going to a style.
Yeah, and one remark there is that I totally agree, that just the chemistry is not enough. Like, you need to do sensory testing, you need to do sensory evaluation, because the equipment we have is just not good enough to only rely on that. That's been the reason why we do sensory testing from the start. When I look at judging, like, the only thing that we don't do that judges typically in these contests do is rate appreciation, right? Give an overall score to a beer. We try to be really descriptive and observant, and try not to have a judgment of the beer, so to say. Again, not meaning that judgment is not valuable. It's just not what we do.
Right.
Good thoughts. And Jacob, I want to come back to you for a minute. And Laura, I think you'll have good insight on this as well. As we slowly get to a more in-person world again, we have a lot of that human interaction taking place on greater levels than we did just a year ago. Jacob, what do you do at White Labs to make sure your staff is educated on the best ways to appreciate and educate on beer? Do you have them go through the Cicerone program? What sorts of sensory activities do they go through to make sure they're the best beer educators possible?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have a pretty, I'm always throwing stuff at them. And right as soon as they start, they go through an onboarding process that myself and a few others here have kind of developed to really train them, not just on the company and what we provide, but on the industry in general, because beer is our main industry that we provide to as a supplier. So once they complete that, then it's pretty much just a continuous educational process where I try to just throw as many materials and resources at them as possible, give them access to memberships that we have through the company. And then we do offer, level 1 4-week programs. That's 2 hours a week to train for certified beer server. It's something that we require. And if you don't have that, we will train to, get you that certification. Because you do have to talk to a lot of different aspects of beer working here, especially behind the bar. And on the science side, but then, also providing them different white papers that are published related to yeast and fermentation, so they can have a general understanding of what's going on and how to speak to that home brewer. Everyone here is reading the yeast book by Chris. That's part of that element series, and really just making sure that we're talking on a daily basis. We run sensory panel weekly, and they're part of that. Getting trained from the very get-go, and then incorporating them as their training progresses, and all these things is just, it's kind of a just continuation. It's not a hard set, like, okay, now you're done and you're good to go from now on. But just continually, it's the same for myself, continually training and continually educating ourselves.
Absolutely. And Laura, in your experiences, which programs, which tools do you recommend to people looking to become, better beer educators?
My default has been the Cicerone program. But I think the most important thing when we're teaching or exposing people on the on the consumer level, or people who are talking directly to consumers, is for they themselves to be able to subjectively think through their own flavors, their own preferences, be able to just understand what they like, but understand that not everyone is going to like the same things, and have tools, descriptive tools, to talk about being able to explain a beer in common language to other people, to be able to have that conversation, give them the tools to have that discussion and be able to communicate, because I think that's where awesome things happen.
That's great insight there. Now, John and Jean, I'd love to hear your feedback, because you're not typically on the directly dealing with the consumer side. With regard to advice you would give to brewers and people in breweries and the consumer, what types of educational opportunities do you find valuable to better appreciate beer?
Good question, Andrew. I'm buying myself a second. But if I focus that on Untappd specifically, and a brewer wanted to know, like, what's the best way to use this, I'll qualify this by saying that Untappd's style guidelines do not match the BJCP. So, and to a lot of aspects, I think they're guidelines. So it gets hard even in the beginning. But what usually is going to help with that consumer, like Laura said, like understandable language that people can relate to. If you gave me a barley wine and you said this has a perfect score on Esther, I would think, wow, this is going to be incredible. If you gave me a barley wine and you said this is Laura Lodge's favorite barley wine, I would think the same thing, and I would want to try them both. And there's, I think, ways that a brewer could use that data, like, this is Laura Lodge's favorite, it's probably really good. Let me check out the Esther profile to make sure I'm brewing my beer to kind of match it. I think there's ways to utilize that. But when it comes to then offloading all that info and data to a customer, in my opinion, the most valuable thing you can do is just give them a description. We made this barley wine inspired by Laura Lodge, who's an expert in big beers, and we use Esther to make sure that the taste profile is great. But what you're going to taste is caramel toffee delicious. Let us know what you think. Something like that. I think it's like having a tasting panel or doing a side-by-side when you just kind of start the consumer down that path of explaining what they're tasting.
That's really good insight there, John. Jean, you're up.
Yeah, I want to like say all of the above, right? So I think all the resources we have there are incredibly valuable, and there's no reason to doubt these methods and processes that have been in place for decades and decades and decades. So the one layer that I would like to add, and I think a challenge for everyone in beer, is, I think I mentioned this in our last conversation, like flavor is a language problem. And so a lot of this is about listening as well, and is about showing empathy and asking the right questions and having a conversation with a consumer. Because you basically, first of all, need to understand, you need to learn their language. You need to speak their language. You need to understand what they're looking for, what they're sensitive to, how they talk about flavor, what words they use, etc. And then you can take your knowledge about sensory, about chemistry, about consumer preferences, about your own experiences, about chemistry, about everything you know, and give them something back in their language. And the big challenge is to learn that language and show that empathy, I think.
That's great, John. And, as we wind down, I'm going to throw out one final, very, very general question. What would you like to see next with regard to how we can just better the overall tasting experience? Are there any goals? I know, Jean, you're taking the unique AI approach to all of this to better the flavor profile and tasting experience. But for everyone here, are there any just next steps you'd like to see breweries either do, or innovations you'd like to see come into the craft beer industry that just better the overall tasting experience, whether in person, whether some way to better the ratings? What would you like to see happen? And there's so many routes that this could go. I'm just curious if anybody has some far off idea you might have had after drinking 3 barley wines that you're like, this would be a really cool way to appreciate beer.
Well, I'll start because mine's not far off and far out. I would really like to see all brewers take the time to figure out those descriptive terms to describe their own beers that we could then use or pull from and find on their website in an easy way, so that all consumer-driven programs would be able to describe the beer the way the brewers would like for them to be described. And likewise, that the restaurateurs and or bars raise the standard for the descriptions that they offer on their menus, and to really help the consumer learn that language of communication and be able to more accurately find things that they're going to enjoy. And I think Jean's goal with Esther will solve some of those issues on the platforms and at the levels that Esther is also used. But I think that if all the little tiny bars and brew pubs and restaurants would take the time to have an amazing beer program like they take the time for their wine, I think we would be so well served just in enjoyment levels of understanding who we are, what we like, and what we order.
Interesting stuff there. John with Untappd, your turn.
I want to just parrot exactly what Laura said for a lack of innovation and creativity this morning. But I think that's to steal from an Oktoberfest example. In September, there's going to be 100 of them on the grocery shelf. And how much tasting am I going to do to get to notify like all 100 of those and place them in my head and come up with a rating system 1 through 100? It's incredibly unlikely, but what would be really valuable to me is, for me personally, knowing, like, did my friends like this, because I value their opinion. But if I'm alone in the grocery store, just being able to flip the label and see this one's got cracker and biscuit flavor, this one has caramel flavor, being able to make a decision like I can when I'm looking at a lunch menu are frequently failing to provide that to the end customer that's making a decision about which Oktoberfest to buy. And the labels are great, but a few tasting profile or tasting notes that ideally were standard, maybe some aroma notes, I think that would really help people find a beer that they're going to enjoy and then celebrate it instead of saying, oh yeah, I had that one, didn't like it.
Thanks for sharing that, John. Jacob?
I was just going to say, they said it, Laura said it perfectly, but I was just going to say a blanket statement that I would say is I would just like to see the tasting experience become more normalized in the general public, where it's not as intimidating or kind of almost pretentious in a way to care about what we're tasting and where that flavor is coming from. That's, how we do that. I think it's just continuing doing what everyone here is doing and continue working on the language, as John said, continue working on showing people how these flavors come about, because it is hard knowing how to taste when you don't know where it's coming from. So hopefully we can continue going towards that direction.
And Jean with Esther, last and certainly not least, you're already way in the future, but what are your far out goals on how we can better the tasting experience?
I hope that it'll become really, really, really personal, right? I hope that we start having the confidence as a consumer that our flavor is our flavor, and that it's okay to taste the way we taste, whatever that way is. And if I like something because it's expensive, so be it. If I like something because it has a pretty label, so be it. And if I like something because of a very subtle flavor, that's also great. And I think that's the ultimate goal, that there is that personal level of appreciation.
I agree with you, and I agree with all of you. I think the quicker we can help people find the right beer for them, the more quality beer they're going to enjoy, the more benefit we'll see in the overall craft beer segment. So I think all these unique approaches, whether it's the data behind the beers or just the actual human in-person experience, they go hand in hand and just educating the consumer better and are ultimately going to help our industry continue to grow. So I really appreciate the four of you joining for us for part 2 today. It's been good continuing this discussion. I don't know, maybe in the future we will do a part 3, but it's fascinating just to think about the way we drink beer and what goes behind it, to educate, but also the decision-making process and where we'll go next. So Everybody, cheers. Thanks again. I'm off to grab a barley wine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Cheers.